Okay. This is recording on Zoom, just getting on Facebook Live here. We're getting there. Let's make sure live is working. Okay, it appears that Facebook Live is working. Let's see if anyone can see me yet. Okay, we're getting there. We're getting there. Okay, looks like I have one viewer, so things must be working here. Okay, great. So we're going to get started here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mike Thomas, and I'm here to talk to you today about what is it to be trauma-informed and how early infant development affects our unconscious habits. So this is a bit to unpack. So I'd like to start by opening up a chart that, for those of you who have seen my work, you may recognize this. It might be pretty familiar to you. So this is, one moment here. This is known as the polyvagal curve. Poly meaning many, branches of the vagus nerve in the autonomic nervous system. The vagus nerve, otherwise known as the wandering nerve, goes from the brainstem, and it works its way down and wanders through all of the viscera in our bodies. So it controls our heart and lungs and our digestive organs, and it supports the automatic functioning of what happens as human beings. So why this is important to understand being trauma informed, is when you look at the polyvagal curve, think of this like a traffic light. Green at the bottom, then yellow, and then red is representative of levels of stress that we can experience in our nervous system. So when we're at the lowest level of stress in the autonomic nervous system, it's a green light response, you might call it. It's where we have coherence. We can experience joy, curiosity. Our cognition works best. We're able to be balanced emotionally, flexible. We can adapt to the situation at hand. And most importantly, we can engage socially with one another. When our body perceives a threat, we move up into the yellow light response, you might call it, the fight-flight response, the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, where we have movement and high degree of awareness of discomfort, of pain. So anxiety can happen there. Hyperactivity, where we can't turn off our thinking, and we can't seem to manage the difficulty of our lives. It's very chaotic. When we get past that level of stress, we move into what's called the dorsal vagal parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, the red light shutdown response, where it's essentially like the brake and the gas on at the same time. So it's a high level of stress, but there's no movement, and we shut down awareness. So we're not aware of what's going on. So being trauma informed means to be aware of the behaviors and particularly the body language that shows in people when they're at these different levels of stress and they have these different levels of the autonomic nervous system functioning. So when someone appears to be calm, yet they have flat affect. And so I'm going to take this off of the screen so you can see my face more clearly. And that way I can demonstrate these things. Great. So if someone appears to be calm, but you notice that they have very little facial expression, they might even look scary. and they might start speaking with a monotone voice. That sets off in your nervous system, most likely, a threat response. But what's going on in their nervous systems that you can perceive through what's called neuroception, your nervous system is perceiving a threat because they are in a heightened state of stress. So much so they're in that red light shutdown response, and they're showing it with their body language by being monotone, and they're not able to respond emotionally. It doesn't look human, right? And it can be scary. But what's going on inside their nervous systems when that's happening is they are shut down. They're unable to feel the signals of their body, and they're unable to express themselves with affect. They can't really express what's going on because they're at such a high level of stress. So interestingly enough, when you drop down below that, you get expressive again, but you might not be contained and coherent. You'll be in a space where, oh my goodness, I can feel all of this discomfort. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. And you keep thinking and thinking and thinking about all of the possible things that could go wrong. You worry, experience anxiety. These are all things that happen in that yellow light response. Notice there's movement in that type of response, whereas up in the shutdown red light response, we don't feel, we don't move. We might not even be conscious. We might even pass out. But depression can happen up there at the red light response. And so all of this is to say that to be trauma informed is to recognize that underneath what is shown on the surface with our behaviors, with our body language, there's something going on in the nervous system corresponding to one or more, a combination of these red, yellow, or green light responses. And so why is this important to know? If someone's in a shutdown response, they look like they're calm, but they have flat affect and they're not using prosody in their voice, they are actually in an immobilized, arguably traumatized state. And if you try and calm someone down when they're in that red light response, it's not going to go well. They stay stuck there. They need to be supported to move in a way that's safe, that gives them a sense of agency, gives them a sense that they are now in control of themselves, because the red light response doesn't happen unless our body perceives that we can't move and fix the situation. So a great example of this is to look at a prey animal like a gazelle and a predator like a cheetah, for example. And this is an example that Peter Levine uses in his work for those of you who are familiar with somatic experiencing. If a gazelle is being chased down by a cheetah, it will be in that yellow light response. Oh, there's a threat. And it moves, it runs, tries to get away. Now, if you're to slow down a video of that happening, where the cheetah actually catches the gazelle, if you were to slow that down just as the jaws of the cheetah grab onto the neck of the gazelle, you'll notice that the gazelle will actually collapse before the cheetah reaches the neck of that gazelle. Why does that happen? Because if the gazelle struggled, if the prey animal struggles, then they're much more likely to get the neck broken, and they're definitely going to be killed by this predator. Right? So this response also happens in humans. When we get to a high enough level of stress where we perceive overwhelm, we can't get out of the situation. To give practical terms to this, it might be public speaking. If that's terrifying to you, and you go up in front of people and you think you're not allowed to not do this, but here you are up in front of people anyway, you might notice, I can't think of what I was going to say. I'm frozen. Oh no, I can't remember what my speech was. This experience, you might have dry mouth, all of the things that happen in your body that are supposed to happen when we're calm and relaxed, those things will go away. Why? Because the body perceives that it needs to shut down in order to survive. Okay. So in a trauma-informed perspective, we're aware that when we shut down, that we need to encourage movement, sovereignty, a sense of control. By the way, this is why when people are acting not very nice and they try and get really controlling, what's going on underneath that behavior? A trauma-informed perspective would help us to recognize underneath that behavior of being controlling, I have to rigidly make sure everything goes my way. There's some level of a shutdown response going on in that person. They don't perceive on an unconscious level, again, back to unconscious behaviors, they don't perceive that they can get through that moment without being very rigid and controlling. So it's not to say that being rigid and controlling is a good thing to do. It's to say that their body is putting them into that mode to protect them from a perceived threat. And this is where early development comes into the conversation. So we're going to put that aside for a moment and think about what the experience is like when, by the way, I have comments open here. So if you want to make comments on Facebook Live, I see that section is open. You're welcome to ask questions if you want me to slow down. But if I don't see anything, I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the next piece. So how does this whole process basically get set up? How is the stage set for our unconscious behaviors, like being controlling or having issues with anxiety or being depressed or having digestive issues? Pretty much any time something's not going well in your mind and your body, what's going on under the surface of that experience is that your autonomic nervous system is in a high stress load. Your body perceives that there's a threat somewhere, either the level of threat at yellow light where you perceive you can fight or flee, or to the level of shutdown, the red light response, where we shut down awareness and shut down movement, and we can't do what we need to do. Okay, so I see there's a comment here. Before I go into development, this year I've chosen not to go to the person that has caused the immobilization in me because I'm not listening to my body, to actual threat, and now realizing what my body is doing. That is such an awesome thing that you're doing for yourself, Cheryl. It's not an easy step to take when you're in an immobilized response. One of the most difficult things to do is to get moving. So figure out how you can get yourself moving away from that setting, like you're talking about. Cheryl's also saying nearly 5 years in shutdown because I've not found safety. This is one of the toughest things about this concept. When we don't have safety in our environment, it's very difficult for the body to find safety. And so, yeah, we want to try and get ourselves out of that environment if at all possible. That's an important step. However, there are also steps that we can take to help our bodies perceive safety, even if we don't have the perfect environmental circumstances. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit today in this live. So thank you for those comments, Cheryl. I'm going to go into development now. So when we are first conceived and develop in utero, in the uterus of our mother, right? The first and second trimesters, there are a lot of physical developments going on. Jump forward to the third trimester of development. There's a lot of influence emotionally having to do with the state of the mother. So if the mother is experiencing stress, her higher levels of cortisol are actually experienced in utero. That baby experiences that higher level of stress. That baby gets to experience those higher levels of cortisol as well. And that will affect that baby's development. So is this to say that mothers need to constantly be, stress-free? No, of course, that's not realistic. But what it is to say is that we need to support mothers. It's so important as that infant is developing that we make sure the mother experiences as much safety and as low of a stress load as possible, because the trajectory of development of that infant is most significantly affected in that third trimester of pregnancy on through 18 months, arguably 2 to 3 years, very critical time. Dr. Bruce Perry talks a lot about social and emotional development early on and how important it is in infancy and in elementary school ages up through 7, 8, even up through 12. So much is passed on down in utero into the nervous system pathways. Those immobilization responses start early, absolutely. As I was mentioning, Bruce Perry talks about how the rate of neuron turnover, so that includes the neurons that are developing, neurogenesis, and the synapses that connect neurons so they can communicate with one another, and the synapses being pruned off and neurons being pruned off. All of this happens early on in third trimester of pregnancy, as well as in infancy, around 10,000 neural connections per second. That's a lot of neural connections. Now, as adults, the turnover of neurons and synapses in our adult development experience is much, much lower. It's about 300, maybe 500, at best 800 neurons per day. So think about that. The magnitude of neurological changes that are happening early in development, 10,000 per second on average, versus a couple hundred per day at best. This is why early development is so important. And so how does that happen exactly? I'd like to break that down for a moment. So this is where being trauma informed is so important, understanding body language communication. So I'm briefly going to go into an NLP model. That stands for neuro-linguistic programming. Neuro-linguistic programming essentially is looking at unconscious patterns, primarily through body language, as well as spoken language, but mostly body language. So the tone of voice that I'm using, the prosody in my voice, I can show you my emotion with how my voice is being conveyed right now. I can show you with my gestures, my enthusiasm. I can show you facial expressions. I can show a posture that shows I'm confident and relaxed and happy where I am right now. I really enjoy speaking in front of people, particularly to large audiences online. I just have developed a love for that. And my body language conveys that. Now, if I was scared, I might show myself being a little bit more rigid. See how tense I just got my upper body and my head going forward a little bit, tensing in my neck, my shoulders might rise. And I'm not exactly sure if what I'm saying is okay. You know, maybe I'll raise the inflection of my voice to show that I'm not exactly sure if it's okay what I'm saying. You know, it's like a question, right? So you can see how body language conveys so much of what's going on inside. Back to early development, the way this primarily happens is between your caregiver, your primary caregiver, your mother, your father, whoever is with you most of the time is going to affect you the most. And it's this exchange of body language through a specific type of neuron called mirror neurons that happen to be in the middle of the prefrontal cortex. You might call it the medial prefrontal cortex. Interestingly enough, where in Eastern wisdom cultures, contemplative culture, spirituality, they refer to this as the third eye, or in Taoism, the upper dantian, middle dantian, lower dantian, chakras, energy centers, right? So interestingly enough, we develop this capacity to know our environment through body language, through these neurons that sponge in the experience emotionally that's conveyed through body language. So if we have a parent that is interacting with us in a way where they can attune to us emotionally, they can hear the cries that we have if we're hungry, or if we're hurting, we have a stomach ache, or if we need a diaper change, or if we're thirsty, or if we just need comfort, or if we're cold and we need to be warmed up and swaddled in a blanket, given a sense of containment. You know, babies are given a sense of safety if you swaddle them, right? So all of that is great, but it's important to understand that every time those interactions happen, there are neurons that are connecting that are related directly to that body language experience of attunement emotionally. So when our parent attunes to us emotionally, it allows us to get a sense of I'm safe. Because as infants, we're helpless. We need to have all of our needs met by our caregivers. And so our sense of safety in the world is cultivated through this exchange of body language. So if we meet our attachment needs with our parents through this body language exchange, if they are emotionally attuned to us and they are consistently available and they're constantly available. You see, we're not able to regulate our nervous systems by ourselves yet when we're infants. This is a really important point. So when we have all of those attachment needs met, and believe it or not, only needs to be met 30% of the time. What about the rest? That's repair. If a parent doesn't get it right, if they keep at it, they'll figure out, oh, that cry doesn't mean they're hungry. It means that they're tired. They need a nap. They need to be supported and stroked and you know, swaddled maybe until they're able to fall asleep because they're tired. and they need that comfort in order to do that. Their nervous systems in that experience are learning, oh, my parent is attuning to me. I'm speaking as if the nervous system had a voice, but it's not conscious. It's not linguistic. It's a feeling that the infant has. And the parent will have this experience as well, this mutual release of oxytocin, which is calming, soothing, gives you this sense of love, warmth, comfort. This creates the experience of safety in the nervous system. And when these attachment needs are met, 30% of the time, and the other 70%, there's repair when things don't go well. What that creates is something called secure attachment functioning. That cultivates a nervous system of the infant as they grow, setting a foundation for being emotionally flexible. They're able to meet their own needs, and they're able to meet other people's needs and be flexible about that. Oh, someone else needs something. I can put my needs aside and I'll be okay. And I can help you to meet your needs. Maybe somebody's feeling particularly sad, and someone who has secure attachment functioning as an adult, they can go to that person and say, hey, what do you need? What are you feeling? What's your experience right now? Can I hear you vent about what you're experiencing and let you know that I understand you, that I can just be there for you and allow you to be as you are, to be imperfect, to be emotionally vulnerable, and have that be okay. That mirrors, that replicates the experience of what's called co-regulation. When we have secure attachment functioning, we co-regulate. We're attuning to one another emotionally, and we do that specifically through our body language. Our mirror neurons pick that up, and we have the experience of being soothed, and our bodies get a sense of safety. Now, going back to that chart where I talked about the green, yellow, and red light responses, that's the green light response when we have that security there. And when that infant goes up into threat, they cry, right? And that's that yellow light response. And then the adult comes back and helps them to soothe, and then go back down to the green light response, lower level of stress. Let's say they cry for a long time and the parent doesn't get there for whatever reason. Well, they'll end up going into the immobilized red light shutdown response. What happens there? They get numb. They maybe fall asleep. They're actually passing out from exhaustion. So it's okay for this to happen sometimes, but there needs to be sufficient repair so that that infant can get a sense. This is unconscious now we're talking about, not like they remember. They don't remember. There's no neural structures in place for them to remember. We'll go into those details another time. They get a sense that when stress gets too high, that they will eventually get support. They will eventually get comfort. They will eventually be soothed to the degree that their nervous system can calm down from red to yellow to green. And they cultivate this over and over again, this resilience, this ability to be stressed and come back out of it. So it's not like yellow light and red light responses are bad. They're adaptive. We're supposed to have those responses. But one thing that needs to be understood here is that when we get stuck in a yellow light response, or we get stuck in a red light response, or a combination between the two, eventually that becomes maladaptive for a lot of reasons. When we're in the green light response, our digestion works well. Our immune system works at its best. If you're being chased by a tiger, your body's not going to prioritize fighting off a cold. It's not going to prioritize digestion. It's not going to prioritize learning something new and interesting. Your body, if it perceives you in a threat response, yellow or red, it's going to deprioritize all of the things that have us rejuvenate, have our cells repair themselves. If we're exercising and we want to get stronger, we need to challenge our muscles. We also need to repair through proper rest. If our stress load unconsciously is up at a yellow or a red light response, it's not going to go so well. We're not going to recover so well. Chances are we're going to store more body fat, or we're going to get really skinny and we're not going to build muscle at all. And maybe we won't store fat. It depends on what systems are operating. And so staying in good shape actually is largely dependent on the mode of our autonomic nervous system. So that's a whole other side conversation. If you're interested in developing more capacity for resilience, so you stay lower in stress load in that green light response to improve your fitness. I have a Facebook group called the HFL 30-Day Fitness Habit Reboot. I'll put it in the comments. You can sign up for that later if you would like. I also have an official 30-day program where every day I'll give you more tips for supporting secure attachment functioning to improve your fitness on all levels. Anyway, that aside, what happens when, oh, let me check these comments real quick. All right, so it looks like Cheryl has also shared here. I attune to my doggies and can read them and help them feel safe and secure to practice a sense of co-regulation. That is so awesome. So we can co-regulate with dogs and cats, even horses. Animals that can be domesticated are able to attune in a different way than animals that are not able to be domesticated. Like a wolf in the wild, obviously it's a predator, but even a prey animal, they're not able to attune to us as well as a dog or a cat. This is why when you speak to a dog or a cat and you use that voice like you would with a cute baby, oh, you're such a good boy, such a good girl, yes you are. When you use that tone, they respond well. And the reason why is because they have the same limbic resonance. And so we can co-regulate with dogs and cats. Now, I should clarify that it's not true co-regulation. They're responding to us and we're responding to them. Stan Tatkin, expert attachment researcher, would call this primarily masturbatory. And what he means by that is that we are getting the benefit from our animals and they're getting the benefit from us, but there's not the same level of attunement as there is with humans. However, it is a really helpful thing to have animals that you can connect with to support your co-regulation experience, because it will calm your nervous system. And because if someone is not able to connect with other human beings because of severe past trauma, and I'm about to get into that in early development and how that affects our attachment system in a moment. If we're not able to connect to human beings, animals are a really great way of helping us to learn regulation when we get triggered unconsciously by humans so easily. And that's something I'm sure a lot of people can relate to. Also, let's see, Christy says, I connect with so much with this. From what I understand, you work with people individually to understand more, develop strategies and how to communicate accordingly. Can you share how we can contact you to learn more? Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Christy. So on my 30-day fitness habit reboot program, I'll put that in the comments at the end of this live. You can also text me 215-292-9834. If you're local, it's probably more prudent to use my number if you're local. That way I can actually connect with you in person. You can also email me at holisticfitnesslifestyle@gmail.com. So again, I'll put that information in the comments at the very end. Cheryl says, yeah, I know this, but it brings some calm. Absolutely. In no way is that less valuable, the co-regulation with animals, because it's not the same as co-regulation with humans. It's extremely valuable. And it's just so awesome when we have animals that we can help us regulate and we can help them regulate. It's a beautiful experience. Okay, so let's get into what happens when we have less than secure functioning conditions in early development. That body language exchange, if there's not sufficient attunement and there's not sufficient repair, there are several categories of non-secure attachment that we can fall into based on how that goes with our caregivers. So the next level up in terms of stress load is an attachment style, you might say, called anxious ambivalent, also known as preoccupied. This happens as a result of caregivers that are not consistent with meeting our attachment needs. Let's say they're anxious and they're actually conveying anxious body language to the child. The child is going to sponge that in through their mirror neurons, and they're going to get a sense of anxiety because that's what the parent is modeling to them. This is why it's so important to do personal growth work as much as you can before you have children. Now, this is not to shame parents who have not done personal growth work. I did none of this before my kids were born. My son was born, I was 19. My daughter was born, I was 20. I had no idea what I was doing. You can help them gain what's called secure attachment, earned adult secure attachment. as well as yourself. You can also do that at any point in life. That's one of the things I help my clients with. So that aside, the insecure, anxious, ambivalent style, otherwise known as preoccupied, happens when there's insufficient attunement. And it's inconsistent is another way of saying that. So let's say, instead of the parent being anxious, let's say they have a drinking problem and they're very attuned to their child most of the time. But as that child grows, there are pretty regular occasions where they get drunk and they can't attune to their child in that moment. That's going to create an inconsistency, which creates what Stan Tatkin might refer to as a hot attachment system. They go up into the yellow light response, that infant and that young adolescent. As they age, they get used to this inconsistent pattern of emotional attunement with body language. Mom, I need something to eat. Not now. I'm busy. Or I'm just too overwhelmed, or whatever the parent might say. This results in the child not being able to learn to regulate their nervous systems through example. This is why doing what I say, not I do, that phrase is so true. What we do as parents is way more influential on the infant and children than what we say. It's what we convey through our body language that communicates most of what the infant picks up as they develop. So if they end up developing this anxious ambivalent response, what they end up growing up in life with is this hyperactive attachment system. Their nervous system is constantly looking for things that are going to go wrong. They're constantly catastrophizing, constantly, I'm in this great relationship, but I just know it's not going to go well. I know something's got to happen. The other shoe's going to drop. Eventually, it's not going to go well. And often they'll end up causing the relationship to not go well because they'll anticipate it not going well, and they'll consistently, maybe they'll pester their partner, or they'll continue to say, oh, you keep telling me I'm beautiful, or I'm handsome, or I'm talented, but I don't believe you. It's this lack of trust that happens as a result of their nervous system being in that yellow light response all the time. We develop what are called neural grooves. Whatever patterns of the autonomic nervous system happen over and over and over and over again, we develop more familiarity, you might say, with those ways of being. And so there's this thing that happens with anxiously attached people where they do this unconscious behavior, again, that concept, unconscious behavior, called protest behavior. Essentially, they're bidding for affection, for attention. They want to support regulating their nervous system. They do this thing called external regulation, meaning they can't self-regulate because they didn't have that consistent attunement as children. And so they learned the pattern of consistently reaching out and trying to get support. Some people refer to these people as needy. I think that that's a shaming term. I don't subscribe to that. I don't think the term needy is very helpful. So Cheryl asks, is that the same as anxious avoidant? No, it is not. That's a completely different category, otherwise known as disorganized. I will get to that. Anxious, ambivalent, sometimes just known as ambivalent. By the way, ambivalence means not being sure. Yes, no, yes, no. There's sort of, the Katy Perry song, you're hot, then you're cold, you're yes, then you're no, you're in, then you're out. They're not consistent. Why? Because their nervous system learned inconsistency. That's why that happens. So Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate is an expert in the fields of trauma, of attachment, and addiction. And he talks about the connection between addiction patterns, that is repeating patterns of behavior that we want to change, but we don't. And there are a lot of nuances to that. But the gist is that lack of secure attachment functioning is directly connected with addictive behavior. And sometimes that can show up as addictive behavior in relationships, this constant bidding for affection in a way that overwhelms their partner. And this gets to the next style of attachment functioning called dismissive avoidant. And so dismissive avoidant happens when the example I gave you of the infant that's left crying for so long that they shut down, they go into the red light response. That's a shutdown response that happens that leads to a lack of awareness, a lack of ability to attune to their own needs, and definitely a lack of ability to attune to other people's needs. And so there's this sense in a dismissive avoidant that they don't have needs. Oh, I'm fine. Oh, I'm always fine. No, I'm good. No problem. Yeah. No, that didn't hurt me. No, that didn't bother me. Oh yeah, I'm always fine. What's going on underneath that behavior is an attachment system that is shut down. It's in the red light response. Technically, it's the same as a trauma response. In infancy and development, this primarily happens from neglect. Now, when I say neglect, it could be a more obvious neglect where the parent is quite literally not attuning to their child. They're ignoring them, or they don't have enough time, or whatever is the reason. They're not sufficiently connecting to that infant's needs in terms of their attachment needs, emotional attunement, consistency, and constancy. So if they don't connect with them emotionally at all, this results in a shutdown. It's this overwhelm that happens because infants can't regulate their own nervous systems. As a result, they develop this dismissive avoidant attachment style where they tend to, by the way, partner with people who are more anxious. Anxious and avoidant dance. I wrote an article on this at one point called The Anxious Avoidant Dance. And it's this dance between partners where one person is the pursuer, the more anxious person, and one person is the distancer, the more avoidant person. And this dynamic happens in a way where the person who's anxious feels this deep need to have their attachment needs met, and they're externally regulating. They're trying to get their needs met by their partner. And unfortunately, the avoidant partner is so shut down from a lack of emotional social development because they were neglected that they need to distance themselves because they're overwhelmed very easily. Now, they probably won't even be aware of this. Remember, part of what happens in the red light response is dissociation, a lack of feeling, a lack of awareness. So not only is there an immobilization response, a lack of movement, you might say, mentally, emotionally, physically, it can happen in all different ways, but a lack of awareness. And so, interestingly enough, in the attachment world where people talk about attachment behaviors and the function in the nervous system and how that affects relationships, a lot of people will demonize the dismissive avoidant when they're actually at a really high level of stress. They probably don't know it. And often what will happen is people who are dismissive avoidant will either avoid this work completely because that's overwhelming. I don't want to feel so much. Or they'll be so shut off from their needs that they'll think they're secure because they're not aware of so much of what's going on inside. So I want to get back to early development and how that can show up. Very well-meaning parents can actually neglect their children, even when they're trying to emotionally attune to their children. And here's how that happens. It's a concept called proximal neglect. Proximal meaning close to, but they're not able to emotionally attune to their infant. And so no matter how hard they try, they're not able to figure out what those signals are. What does this cry mean? Is the baby hungry? Is the baby thirsty? Do they need support? And eventually they just give up. Or they don't even know that they missed it in the first place and they do the wrong thing. And there's this lack of attunement. And so that leads to dismissive avoidant attachment patterns of behavior. So this is important to recognize because this gets passed down through the generations. Whatever the attachment style is that is manifesting for you in this moment or you see in somebody else. By the way, it's important to focus on yourself, not your partner or anybody else. You're not going to help them by saying, what's wrong with you? We can talk about it, but there needs to be consent, being ready, willing, able, and informed, as my friend Philippe Lewis likes to share and teach. I love that definition of consent, being ready, willing, able, and informed. And of course, all of those things have a lot of depth to them. Anyway, so whatever your attachment style is that's showing up in this moment, it's important to look at what goes on underneath that behavior. And here's why I brought up Dr. Gabor Mate, actually. He has this saying, it's not why the behavior that we should be asking. It's why the pain underneath the behavior. And what he means by that is the way we develop early on with our caregivers sets up a nervous system response, a survival response that shows up in behaviors that most of us have no idea are correspondential to a survival pattern. We don't know that anxiety is our body thinking that we need to fight or flee to get out of the situation. And it could lead to an adult behavior of constantly busying yourselves, constantly, oh, what's the next thing I can educate myself on? You wouldn't believe how many certifications I've gained over the last 10 years because I just needed to keep my mind busy. It was a distraction to keep me from feeling. And once I learned that, I learned to benefit from all the things that I can learn, and at the same time, take a moment to feel my feelings. And this is a process that unfolds throughout life and you can develop constantly. So, Cheryl, to answer your question about the anxious avoidant. So that name denotes both anxious, the yellow light response primarily, and avoidant, the red light response. It's a combination between the two. They can display both types of behaviors. So if you were to look at that chart, the polyvagal chart with that bell curve, right? And your green light, yellow light, red light responses, right? The green light response is the lowest level of stress where secure attachment functioning happens. The yellow light response, more anxious, ambivalent, or preoccupied attachment patterns. And the red light response, more dismissive, avoidant, immobilized, unaware, shut down response patterns. When we experience early on fear in the presence of our caregivers, now that could mean abuse, that they're directly abusing the infant or the child, and that will result in this anxious avoidant attachment style, otherwise known as disorganized. But it could also happen because the caregiver is fearful, and the mirror neurons that allow for this exchange of body language to happen with the parent and the infant, it results in the child learning that fear behavior. So if the mother is being abused by the father and the child is primarily attached to the mother, well, the mother isn't abusing the child. It's the father that's abusing the mother, but the child will pick up that behavior. The child will pick up that response. Oh, this is how the nervous system needs to be positioned to be prepared for threats that show up in life. So this is actually adaptive, because if we're in an environment of war and there are constantly threats around, then it's going to result in the infant developing this capacity to constantly scan the environment unconsciously for threats and be ready. So this is good, because if a car suddenly comes out of nowhere, you jump out of the way automatically without thinking about it. That's that survival response to flee, to get out of the way. Or if you get cornered by somebody and you have the sufficient resources, maybe you've been trained in martial arts and you realize there's no other way to get out of it but then to fight your way out of it, well, then you can fight. And that's still the yellow light response. So getting back to the anxious avoidant, otherwise known as disorganized, when there's fear in the presence of the caregiver with the infant, whether the fear is being caused through abuse or the parent is experiencing fear and the baby is sponging that in with those mirror neurons and taking on that experience, it creates what's known as disorganized attachment or fearful avoidant. Going above and below that line where the yellow light response happens and the red light response happens, above and below, this pattern, this wave of going into shutdown and then mobilized fear, and shutdown and mobilization, immobilization, mobilization. That's called the PTSD cycle in certain neurological science areas of study. So what's going on there is the body can't find an organized way of adapting to the situation. Should I shut down? Should I mobilize and fight or flee? Should I shut down? Should I mobilize, fight, or flee? And it alternates between the two. And so this can show up. And so let's zoom out from what we normally look at in terms of diagnoses when we look at symptoms. For example, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, very well may be, if not properly diagnosed and look at their history. How did they develop? Did they have an abusive home? Did they experience neglect? Honestly, how would we know that unless the parents are aware of that and they tell the children, yeah, this is what you experienced, we need to work on this. Most of the time, it just gets swept under the rug. Most of the time, the way we learn that we have these adaptations is it shows up in our behavior and we realize, well, I don't know exactly how it happened, but here are these behaviors. Here's my body responding this way. And so that's what's going on. So if you zoom out from, absolutely, Cheryl, I'm with you on that. Autism, very possible. I haven't studied that as deeply as I've studied ADHD, but I think it's very possible that there's some level of a shutdown trauma response with autism. And I am by no means an expert in that area, but I suspect that it's connected. So I'm with you there. So the PTSD cycle of the disorganized response, it's because there's not an organized response of either being yellow or red in that response. It doesn't know what to do. So here's kind of why that happens. And I think that this is a helpful model to look at. So Dan Siegel, Dr. Dan Siegel, who's also an attachment researcher, talks about this handy model of the brain. Imagine that this is the brain, this is the spinal cord, and the palm represents the brainstem, the deepest part of our neurological structures connected to our reptilian ancestors, to reptiles. And the thumb, and if I had a mutated thumb over here, it'd be more even, but there would be both sides here, of the limbic brain corresponds to our mammalian ancestors. And this part of the brain controls emotion. It controls our attachment system. It controls memory and making meaning of things. Whereas the brainstem corresponds to the unconscious primal survival adaptations like fight, flight, freeze, or fawning to people please. And by the way, people pleasing on an unconscious level actually is an adaptation to trying to dispel a threat before it happens, to try and appease the perceived attacker. That's a whole other topic that we can go into another time. So the brainstem, the reptilian part, the limbic brain, the mammalian part, and these fingers represent the cortex, the primate level of evolutionary development of our neural structures. So when we have secure attachment functioning, we have our survival brain, including the fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses, right? And our ability to feel, make meaning, attach, and regulate our nervous systems through co-regulation. And we can coherently describe what's going on. We can have a narrative, a story about what's going on. That's distinctly a human experience. So that's secure attachment functioning. Our cortex is down-regulating, that is, keeping this in check, the experiences of going into a more animalistic type of behavior. When we flip our lids, when we have too much stress, especially if our early development has non-secure attachment functioning, we end up functioning with less human capacities: empathy, forethought, planning ahead, creativity, spontaneity, joy, social engagement. All of these things happen when we're in secure attachment functioning. When we get triggered, we still have organization going on. That is, we have either anxious, as I mentioned before, the yellow light primary response, or the red light response of shutting down. That's organized. Okay, so both the insecure attachment styles, anxious ambivalent, the yellow light, as well as the dismissive avoidant, the red light shutdown response, those are organized. They're predictable. When someone has an anxious adaptation, they have protest behavior. Their attachment system heats up, you might say, and they try and figure out any way to bid for attention, for affection. That's organized. Now, another form of organized insecure attachment functioning is the dismissive avoidant, that red light response. And when that happens, they shut down awareness. Oh, I don't have needs. No, nothing's wrong. I'm fine. And they're numb to experiencing what's going on inside. They're not able to read their signals very well. Those are organized responses. Getting back to what you asked about before, Cheryl, the anxious avoidant, otherwise known as disorganized, is when the limbic brain, metaphorically, is not organizing our responses. And so the need to attach to our caregivers and the need to run away from threat are at odds. If we're in fear with our caregivers, these two aspects of our brain are in conflict. They are disorganized, hence the term disorganized attachment. In infant studies of attachment styles, they showed secure children being separated from their parents and coming back and getting soothed by their parents and then going back to play. The anxious children, when they were separated from their parents and then the parent came back in, they held on and they didn't want to let go. They needed that external regulation. The dismissive avoidant children, they didn't even notice the parent come back in the room. They were independent, but what was going on under the surface is a really stressed nervous system. It's that red light response. The disorganized children, it was really sad what happened with them. Clearly, they had experienced fear in the presence of their caregivers during early development, and what they did was somewhat unpredictable. It was disorganized. Some of them would pull their hair or they would start self-harming. They would hit their heads against the wall. They would run in circles toward their caregiver and away, not sure what to do. And this is a survival response. What they learned early on in their body language exchange with their attachment figures was disorganized. Their source of attachment, their limbic brain perceived, my caregiver is the source of fear. These are not working in conjunction anymore. It's disorganized. And so a lot of people who struggle with addiction to the degree where they're homeless and they just can't organize what's going on in their lives has to do with this disorganized attachment style. And I could go on and on about this on another live. But for now, I just want to clarify that secure, non-secure, the anxious or the avoidant types, and then the disorganized where there's no organization and it's just chaos back and forth between the red and the yellow light responses. These are all survival adaptations that lead to adult behaviors that really call for compassion, not for judgment. And often in our culture, we've been taught, okay, well, if someone is using an illegal substance, put them in jail, punish them. It's actually the exact opposite of what someone's traumatized needs. They need compassion, they need support. Obviously, when someone's being abusive, it's not okay to condone that behavior. We don't want to go, oh, you just must be hurting. If someone's being abusive, get out of that situation. Stop that behavior. That's important. I want to be clear on that. However, underneath the surface, there are issues that need to be addressed that have to do with what's underneath the behavior. Those unconscious behaviors, our feelings, our perceptions, even the way we think and see the world. Oh, life is unfair. That's an insecure attachment pattern oriented thought pattern. Nothing's wrong. I'm always okay. That's a dismissive avoidant attachment pattern. Things never go right. I'm just not good enough. I can't do it right. That's an anxious ambivalent attachment style pattern way of thinking. Sometimes things happen and it's out of my control and I'll just do the best that I can. And let's see what we can learn. That would be more of a secure attachment pattern type of way of thinking. So as you can see, all of these different behaviors that we can experience ourselves and with our partners, with our children, with our friends and family, even with strangers, all of it comes back down to how we were attuned to emotionally and exchanged body language to develop our neural structures. And the way that we can improve the way that we're functioning, however we're functioning now, honestly, whatever happened, it already happened. What can we do now to make it better? So the way I like to look at trauma and the experience of creating resilience and healing trauma, I like to use the metaphor of an old TV screen, where, there are not very many pixels. I don't know much about that technology, so I don't know how many pixels are in an old TV screen. But imagine trauma shatters you into a million pieces. Healing that trauma is about identifying all of those different pieces, all of those unconscious behaviors, and differentiating them. That is, figuring out what all of the pieces are and where they come from, where we are on that attachment map of the autonomic nervous system. Green light, yellow light, red light, maybe a combination of two of those or more. And going, okay, so now that I've distinguished all of the pieces and I have a sense of what's going on, what my body thinks it needs to do versus what I want it to do, now I can start to put those pieces together. I can link them. Going back to Dr. Dan Siegel, he talks about this concept of integration. That is the linkage of differentiated parts. And he uses, well, let me finish my metaphor first before I go into his metaphor. So if you put all of those pieces together, imagine that you're able to put that shattered TV together in a coherent way. I know this isn't how it really works, but just go with this for the metaphor, for the sake of my metaphor. I like it. You put it together and you create this amazing HD screen, which has thousands and thousands of pixels. It's a more integrated picture. We've now differentiated all those pieces and we've linked them together. And that creates integration, coherence. And what we get is more resilience, more ability to function when things don't go well. We've already been as low as we can be. And so we put together all of those pieces into a coherent picture. It's called integration. And we have this improved resilience because we've gone through adversity and we've healed that process. Primarily, that's done in the body first, not in the cognitive brain. And I'll go into that in another live. So going to Dan Siegel's metaphor here for integration, when you have different fruits, let's say, and you have bananas, you have oranges, you have strawberries, but they're separated. And okay, I can eat a banana, I can eat a strawberry, I can eat that orange, but they're not linked together. And so that would be, you might call that rigid. They're not connected, they're separated. That would be like the red light response of the avoidant dismissive behavior, where there's a lack of awareness. There's a lack of being able to distinguish all the different parts of ourselves, to be aware of what our bodies are telling us. If you're hungry or if you're thirsty or if you're anxious, what does my body tell me in terms of sensations? You won't be able to connect to that in the rigid response of the avoidant dismissive red light response. Now, if you were to throw all of those pieces of fruit into a blender and make a smoothie, that would be more like the chaotic yellow light response of the anxious ambivalent type. And so, yeah, you have all of these fruits and they're blended together, but you can't distinguish the separate pieces of fruit. You no longer have an orange and a strawberry and a banana. Now you have a fruit smoothie, okay? Integration is the linkage, yet the differentiation of those parts. It's more like a fruit salad. And so you're able to take all of the different parts, like the TV metaphor, where you're looking at that HD screen, because you've taken all of those pieces and you've put them together, it creates more resilience. So the good news about all of these things that we've just learned is that there is hope. Not only is there hope, the more severe your trauma, the more resilience you're capable of cultivating. And if you look through history, and even people who are alive now, at some of the greatest people in history, they've had severe trauma and they've learned to integrate that. I'm a fan of Tony Robbins' work. I think he's wonderful, and his intention, he's controversial in some ways. Let's put that aside. He went through severe trauma early on, abuse, and he used that to try and go out there and help people. And he created success for himself, and now he helps people to cultivate sovereignty, to connect to their needs, to do a lot of the things I'm describing here. I think his work is remarkable. Look at anyone you know who has really struggled and they've come out the other side. There's just something about them, isn't there? They have this capacity to recognize adversity, to have empathy for it, and keep themselves from getting sucked into it, and supporting, to be sovereign, yet connected and empathetic. And that's what healing trauma does. So I'm just going to check here and see if there are any more comments. Paul, hi, how's it going? Are tantrums an anxious attachment style in child development? Absolutely. Yes. So if it's a chronic issue where the child has tantrums all the time, yes, they've probably developed an anxious ambivalent attachment style. That's likely. Um, can that change? Absolutely. They just need more repair to cultivate resilience. They need more reassurance is essentially what's going on. Depending on all of the nuances, if it's a special needs child, there's going to be different things to address there. If the environment is still perpetuating a sense of inconsistency, that's also something to address. But you can make it better by continuing to attune emotionally and to help them to help that child to see, I'm here, I see you, and it's okay how you are. So let's see here. Unpredictable parental behavior, not safe to connect, so I shut down to protect me. Yeah. It's pretty amazing how all these things are connected, isn't it? And it's, there's some sadness there for sure. Okay, loving the way you're explaining this. It's helping. I'm so glad, Cheryl. Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. No repair, total fear of attachment. Absolutely. If there's no repair that we've experienced early on, it's going to be really scary to get into a relationship. And we're probably going to get hot and cold and push people away and go, oh, but I want a relationship because that will help soothe my nervous system. I'm feeling like I'm getting too close. I need space. I know this pattern very well. I experienced quite a bit of early childhood adversity, emotionally, as well as physical abuse. And that led me to a disorganized attachment system. I had a pretty traumatized attachment system. I thought I had ADHD. I'm very clear from my own personal analysis of going to different professionals, including the Amen clinics. They scanned my brain and helped me to figure out what systems in my brain were overactive and what were underactive. But the big picture that I've learned for me personally is that those ADHD symptoms of being spaced out and hyperactive, red light, yellow light, spaced out, hyperactive, it was the PTSD cycle, the disorganized attachment adaptation. So if there are no more questions, I'm going to bring this to a close here. Oh, self-sabotage comes in due to expecting danger or issues. We create issues to recreate the same issue we are needing resolution from. Absolutely. That's a really great point, Cheryl. So what Cheryl's speaking to here in that comment, I believe, is that we recreate the situations unconsciously in our relationships that we experienced early on in development, so that we have the opportunity to heal those things. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that those behaviors are familiar. So we're going to find an attachment match, someone who displays body language that unconsciously has us feel, that's familiar. If it's a non-secure attachment pattern that we had early on, chances are we're going to be attracted to excitement, but it's also going to lead to a lot of chaos and challenges in relationship. And no matter what style you happen to be exhibiting, you can experience repair. You can go, oh, this is what's happening. This is where I am on that nervous system map. And this is what I need in order to make it better. So I can help you with specifics if you work with me one-on-one. You could also come join my free Facebook group. As I said, I'll put that in the comments after this live is over. And I also have a full 30-day program that will be starting sometime in January. My guess is probably the third week of January at this point. So let me just double check here if there are any other comments to answer questions. So appreciate you deep on this path of learning. Thank you so much, Cheryl. I appreciate that. It's a process. We have to keep at it. And you're welcome. I keep attracting emotionally unavailable. Eek. Yeah, tell me about it. That's a pattern that is very difficult to break. And ultimately, these patterns started in relationship with our caregivers. And that's also how we will change it, is in relationship through co-regulation. Whether we're more anxious and we tend to have protest behaviors, which tends to push people away, we need to learn self-regulation instead of just externally regulating, so that when we connect with people, it's more reciprocal. If we're more avoidant and we try and keep more distance with people, we need to learn how to become more aware of what's going on inside so that we can recognize and empathize with the people that we want to connect with the people that we love. It's important to develop an awareness of where we are on this map so that we can know, okay, what does my body think that it needs? Is it actually in the danger that my body is saying that it thinks I am? If you're feeling anxious, it thinks you need to fight or flee. If you're depressed or shut down, it thinks you need to shut down to survive, a life threat response. So if that's not actually what's happening in your life, you can start to look at, okay, so my body thinks this is what's happening. What's actually happening, and how can I show my body that it's safe? How can I show my body that it's okay? And that's a process of showing the body, not the mind, not the cognitive brain, or even the limbic brain. The cognitive or the limbic brain, we need to address feeling safe first. And that's a body experience. That's not something we can think our way through. Often we hear this adage out there, mind over matter. You can make things happen if you really want it enough. And there's some truth to that. However, going back to what I started to say earlier, and I didn't finish, the NLP model, every second we take in about 2 million bits of information unconsciously through body language. And we process about 40 million bits of information. Consciously, we're only aware of 126 bits versus 2 million. And we process only about 40 bits versus consciously versus unconsciously processing 40 million. So what's going on in the unconscious structures is just way more powerful. That's why mind over matter usually doesn't work if you have enough trauma or chronic stress in your system. It's going to have you flip your lid. And that's why a trauma-informed perspective looks at what's going on underneath the surface of behavior. Like Gabor Mate says, it's not why the behavior we should be asking about. It's why the pain underneath the behavior, that unconscious need to survive that's having us flip our lids. Because if we calm this down, we calm our bodies down, get it to feel safety, we'll naturally be able to put our cortex back online and be more human, be the best versions of ourselves that we can be. So, oh, you're so welcome, Paul. Thank you so much for listening and joining. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Christy. And for anyone else who hasn't commented and I don't see you here, thank you so much for joining. And I'm going to bring this to a close. If I can figure it out, I'm going to upload this on YouTube so you can watch this later. So have a wonderful day, everyone. And I will see you soon. Cheers.